The cowgirl broke the horse. The cowboy finally understood why she was different. The rope was still wet when I picked it up off the fence post. Coiled wrong, too. Whoever'd left it hadn't worked a day with rope in their life, or they were too tired to care. I coiled it right and hung it back, and that's when I heard the horse. Not screaming, not the frantic kind of noise a green animal makes when it's afraid. This was different. A low, almost questioning sound, and then silence, and then hooves on dry earth slow. I turned. She was in the round pen with a gray roan that had put 3 men in the dirt that week. I'd watched one of them go, Ellers, a big loud hand from the Dakotas who rode like he was trying to punish the horse for existing. The roan had sent him clean over the fence, and then stood there blowing through its nose like it had made a point. She wasn't trying to ride it. She was just standing there, in the middle of the pen, the horse on the far side watching her. She had her back to me, and I could see she wasn't holding anything, no rope, no flag, nothing. Just her in a plain brown work shirt, one hand at her side, one thumb hooked in her belt. I don't know how long I stood there watching before I realized I was holding my breath. My name is Cal Briggs. I was 53 years old that summer, and I had spent 31 of those years doing the kind of work that doesn't get remembered. Scouting, guiding, carrying dispatches through country that didn't want me in it. I'd ridden for the army in territories you won't find on most maps now, alongside men who are mostly dead, in service of an arrangement between the government and the land that I spent a long time trying not to think too hard about. What I was good at was watching, reading country, reading weather, reading the small signals that told you whether the next hour was going to be ordinary or the last ordinary hour you'd have for a while. I had come to the Cassidy Ranch outside Alamosa because a man I trusted, Wade Pryor, had said Delia Cassidy was looking for a foreman and that she paid fair and didn't hire fools. That was the whole endorsement. Wade wasn't a man who wasted words. What he hadn't said was anything about her. I had arrived 3 days before, on a Tuesday in the afternoon, after a ride that had taken 6 hours, and left my right knee talking to me the way it did now in cold weather or long distances. I'd dismounted at the gate, and a boy of about 14 had come out to take my horse. I'd asked if Miss Cassidy was available, and the boy had looked at me and said she was in the barn. The barn was behind the main house, and I walked through it end to end and didn't find her. What I found were the cleanest stalls I'd seen on a working ranch in a long time, good hay stacked and not rotting at the bale edges, the smell of a well-kept place rather than a neglected one. The tack room door was open, and every piece of leather hung up and oiled. I noticed these things because they told me something. I walked out the back of the barn and found her on the ground underneath a wagon with a broken axle, her legs sticking out, a wrench in one hand. I said, Miss Cassidy. She said, without coming out, you're Briggs. I said I was. She said that axle's been cracked since March. You know wagons. I said I knew enough. She slid out from under it. She was maybe 40, maybe a few years either side. Dark hair gone silver at one temple. Her face had lines from weather, not worry, there's a difference, and I knew it. She looked at me the way you look at a piece of equipment you're trying to assess fairly before you buy it. She said, Wade says you can read country. I said, I've been known to. She said, I've got 2,000 acres, and I need someone who can tell me where the north fence line is failing before the cattle tell me. You start Monday. That was the whole interview. Now it was Thursday, and the gray roan was walking toward her. Not fast, not in a straight line, more like it had decided to drift in her direction and was trying to make it look like its own idea. She didn't move. The horse stopped about 6 feet from her and put its head down and blew through its nose into the dirt, then raised it and looked at her. She lifted one hand, slow, and held it out flat, fingers down. The roan stepped forward and put its nose against her palm. That was all, just that. But I'd been around horses my whole life, and I had never once seen that animal, that particular animal, do anything close to willing. It had been caught and roped and fought for a solid week, and here it was. She turned then and saw me at the fence. She didn't look surprised. She just said, How long have you been standing there? I said, long enough. She came through the gate and latched it behind her. The roan stood watching her go, which told me something else entirely. She said, they've been trying to break him the wrong way. I said, I noticed. She looked at me sideways and said, most men don't. I didn't say anything to that. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it sat in my chest in a way I wasn't expecting, and I didn't trust myself to talk around it without sounding like a fool. This is the part I have trouble telling in the right order because memory doesn't work the way a written account does. It doesn't go Tuesday, then Wednesday, then Thursday. It goes by weight. The heaviest things float to the top, even if they happened later. So let me tell you the heaviest things, and then I'll come back around to the days. The heaviest thing is this: I had not been seen in a long time. I don't mean literally, I mean the other kind. The kind where someone actually looks at you and takes your measure and decides you matter. I had worked for 20-odd employers over 31 years and been good at my job for most of them, and at the end of each arrangement they shook my hand or didn't, and I rode away and they went on running their operation, and in a year they couldn't have told you my name without thinking about it. I was useful in the way a good tool is useful. You're glad to have it. You don't think about it when it's put away. I had gotten used to that, or I thought I had. You can convince yourself of a lot of things when the alternative is to sit with what's true. My wife died in 1881. That's 11 years before the summer I'm telling you about. We'd had 7 years, and they were good years, and I have never replaced them with anything. I'm not sure I wanted to. It is easier to miss something than to risk losing it again, and I had grown old enough to know that about myself without particularly liking it. I had come to a Lamosa because Wade said it was good work, and I needed work, and that was the size of it. Or that's what I told myself. The second week I was there, I rode out to the north fence line on a Monday morning early before the hands were up. I'd been worrying at a problem in my head. The land at the north end fell away into a draw that collected snowmelt, and the fence posts would be rotted at the bases, soft. You couldn't see it from horseback until you were right on it. You had to know what to look for. I found about 40 yards of it that wouldn't hold anything with ambition. Replaced 8 posts before noon with lumber I'd loaded on the pack horse, tamped them in, and was back at the ranch by mid-afternoon. Delia Cassidy was at the water trough when I came in. She watched me unsaddle and said, "North fence." I said yes. She said, "How bad?" I told her what I'd found and what I'd done. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The hand who rode that line in April said it was fine." I said it wasn't fine in April. He just didn't know what he was looking at. She looked at me for a long moment, not unfriendly, just measuring. She said, "How did you know where to look?" I said, "The draw collects. Once I knew where the draw was, I knew where the fence would fail." She said, "Nobody's figured that out in 3 years." I said, "Maybe nobody looked at the land first." She said, "No, maybe not." She went back to whatever she was doing, and I put my horse up, and that was all. But for the rest of that day, I caught myself thinking about the way she'd said it. The way she hadn't thrown a compliment at me the way people throw scraps, just to be done with it. She'd said it like she was filing it away, like it was a thing worth noting about a person. The third week, she asked me to ride with her to the eastern pasture to check on a section of cattle that had been drifting toward a neighbor's fence. It was a 2-hour ride out, and she didn't talk much, which suited me. She rode well, not showy, not working at it, just easy and correct. At the pasture, we found the problem. A section of fence down and about 30 head on the wrong side of it. We spent 3 hours working them back and another hour on the fence. And by the time we were heading back, the sun was already dropping and the air was cooling fast in the way it does at elevation. She had a cut on her right hand from the wire. I noticed it when she was coiling fence wire, the way blood was tracing a line along the side of her palm. I said, "That needs to be cleaned." She said, "I know." I said, "You got anything in your saddlebag?" She said she didn't, and that it was fine, and that she'd been cut by wire before. I had a piece of clean cloth and a canteen. I didn't ask. I just held out the cloth and said, "Here." She looked at me and something passed across her face that I can't fully name. Not annoyance. Not gratitude exactly. Something more like recognition. Like she'd seen this gesture in her life and hadn't seen it in a while. She held out her hand. I poured water over it and wound the cloth around it and tied it off with her help, and neither of us said anything while I did it. When I let go of her hand, she said, quietly, without looking at me, "Thank you, Cal." It was the first time she'd used my name. I said it was nothing, because I didn't know what else to say, and we rode back in the last of the light without talking. The thing about dignity is that you don't know how much you've lost until someone starts giving it back. I had been a capable man my whole life. I had read more country than most men ever see, tracked through snow and dark and rain, kept my head in situations that hadn't been kind about it. But nobody had looked at me in a long time and thought, this particular man, and not just any useful body. I want to be careful here because what happened between Delia Cassidy and me was not sudden. It had no scene where something turned. There was no moment I could point to and say that's where it changed. It was more like weather. You don't see the season turning while it's turning. You just realize one day that the light is different and the cold has come or gone. What I noticed across those weeks was small things. She asked my opinion and waited for the actual answer rather than the short one I gave when people didn't really want to know. She remembered what I'd told her, not just the practical details, but the way I'd framed something, and she'd come back to it a week later and tell me she'd been thinking about it. She didn't talk down to her hands, but she talked to me differently than the others, and eventually I understood it wasn't just because I was the foreman. She was, I realized slowly, a person who paid attention, and she had started paying it to me. In August, there was a situation. A man named Fowler, who ran cattle about 12 miles east and had been unfriendly about the shared water rights since the previous spring, sent 3 of his hands onto Cassidy land on a Wednesday morning to drive a section of her cattle toward his fence line. The plan, as near as I could work out later, was to move them far enough that he could claim they'd wandered onto his property and were forfeit. I found out because one of our younger hands, a boy named Tomas, had ridden out early and seen them doing it and come back to tell me. I went to Delia. I said, Fowler's men are on your land. They've got about 40 head and they're moving them east. She said, how many men? I said 3. She said, we going to ride out there? I said, yes. She said, just us? I said I'd take Tomas. He's steady. She looked at me and said, you think Fowler will push it? I said, no, not if we go out there calm and certain. He's gambling on you not noticing fast enough. Once he sees you know what he did, he'll back down. He's that kind. She said, you've read men like him before. I said, enough times. She said, all right, let's go. We rode out, the 3 of us, and we found Fowler's men at the fence line, just like Tomas had said, the cattle milling on the wrong side. I did the talking. I told them, flat and without heat, that they were to leave the cattle where they were, that we knew exactly how many head there were and where they'd started the morning, and that if they'd like to discuss water rights, they could have their employer contact Miss Cassidy through a proper channel. The 3 of them looked at each other. The one in charge, a heavy-set man with a brown hat, said something under his breath that I didn't ask him to repeat. They rode away. We worked the cattle back ourselves. It took about 2 hours. On the ride home, Delia was quiet for the first mile or so, and then she said, you didn't raise your voice once. I said, no point in it. She said, Fowler's men are used to men who shout. That's what he sends them out for, to make the other side shout first. I said, I know. She said, you knew that going in. I said, yes. Another silence. Then, Cal, where did you learn to handle that kind of thing? I thought about it. I said, 30 years of situations where shouting made everything worse. She laughed, not a big laugh, just a short, real one. And then she said, I'm glad you're here. She said it plainly, looking straight ahead at the trail. I am glad you are here. I didn't say anything back. I just nodded. But I turned that sentence over for the rest of the day like a coin you keep finding in your pocket, surprised each time it's still there. September. The roan had a name by then. She called him Sage, which he'd told her he was, apparently, in whatever language horses use for that. She'd been working with him for 6 weeks, and he was not broke in the way the hands would have broke him. He wasn't crushed down to compliance, but he was willing. There's a difference. A broke horse does what it has to. A willing horse makes a decision and makes it again each time. I watched her ride him for the first time on a Sunday morning early, when the light was still coming sideways across the flats, and the air had the first real chill of autumn in it. She came out of the round pen and into the larger pasture, and he moved under her like he'd decided she was worth carrying. She didn't push him into anything. She just let him find his own stride and went with it. I was sitting on the top rail of the fence with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I watched her move out across the pasture until she was small in the distance, and then circle back. And when she came through the gate, she was flushed with the cold and something else. The particular look of a person who has done a thing exactly the way they knew it ought to be done. She slid down and stood beside the horse and looked at me. She said, "You've been watching me work with him since the first week." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I thought about how to say it honestly. I said, "Because you were doing something I'd never seen done that way, and I wanted to understand it." She was quiet for a moment, rubbing Sage's neck. Then she said, "Most men look at what I do and see what I'm not doing. They see a woman not using force and they think it's soft. They don't see that it takes more knowledge, not less." I said, "I see that." She looked at me. She had a directness about her, always had, that didn't give you room to be anything but honest back. She said, "I know you do. I noticed that early on." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You look at things until you understand them. I've watched you do it with the land, with the cattle, with the men. You don't look the way most people look, which is just long enough to decide what to think. You look until you actually see." I didn't know what to say to that, which happened with her more than I was used to. She said, "That's rare, Cal, you know that." I said I didn't particularly. She smiled, not a soft smile, just an honest one. She said, "That doesn't surprise me either." We had the first hard frost in the second week of October, and then the snow came early, a good foot of it by Halloween, and the work changed to the winter rhythm that any rancher knows, checking the herd, breaking ice on the water, keeping the barn warm enough. There is a specific exhaustion to winter ranch work that is different from summer exhaustion. Summer wears you out with heat and distance. Winter wears you out with cold and sameness. But there is a closeness to it too, everyone gathered in, the days shorter and the evenings longer. I had taken to having supper at the main house 2 or 3 nights a week. It had started as a practical thing. There were accounts to go over, plans for the spring, and it was easier to spread things out at her table than to do it in the bunkhouse doorway. But it had become something else, and I think we both knew it had become something else and were, for different reasons, careful about naming it. One evening in November, she poured coffee after supper and sat down across from me and said, "Tell me something I don't know about you." I said, "Like what?" She said, "I don't know anything. Where did you grow up?" I said, "Missouri, east of Springfield. My father worked a grist mill. I left at 17 and didn't go back much." She said, "Why did you leave?" I said, "The same reason most young men leave. I thought there was something out here that was worth more than what I had." She said, "Was there?" I thought about it. I said, "Some things were better, some weren't. The country is what I thought it would be. The rest of it was more complicated." She said, "What do you mean by the rest of it?" I said, "The way it actually went. How things work out isn't usually what you pictured when you were 17. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I was married for 12 years. He was a good man. He got sick and he died and I kept the ranch because what else would I do? I've been here 8 years on my own. It's a good life. But it's—" She stopped. I said, "Quiet." She said, "Yes, quiet." We sat there for a while with the fire going and the snow against the window, and I thought about how long it had been since I'd sat with someone and not needed to fill the silence up. She said, "I've had men want to run this place for me, since Archer died, men who thought I needed someone to tell me what to do with it." I said, "I imagine." She said, "You've never done that, not once. You do your job and you tell me what I need to know, and you let me make the decisions." I said, "It's your ranch." She said, "I know it is. I just want you to know that I know you know it. That's not nothing." I said, "I know it isn't." She looked at me across the table. There was something in her face I hadn't let myself read directly until then, and I looked at it plainly now. It was not pity. It was not the look someone gives a capable employee they're fond of. It was the look you see maybe 2 or 3 times in a life if you're paying attention and if you're lucky. She said, "Cal, I don't know if you've been looking for something out here all these years, but I hope you know that whatever you were looking for, you don't have to keep moving." I said, "Is that what you're telling me?" She said, "That's what I'm telling you." I put my hand on the table and she put hers over it. Just that, her hand on mine, warm, the weight of it. I said, "I've been told I was useful before, a lot of times. Nobody ever told me I was worth staying for." She said, "That's their failing, not yours." I want to be careful not to round this off the wrong way. Life doesn't round off. There were hard winters after that one, and some seasons where the money was tight and the work was punishing, and things between us were short-tempered in the way two people get when they're working themselves down to nothing, and there's nowhere to go. We lost cattle to a bad storm in '94. We had a dispute with the county that took 2 years to settle. There was a spring, the year after that, when I wasn't sure I was good for her, when I thought the gap between what I was and what she deserved was too wide to bridge, and I nearly convinced myself of it. She found me on the porch one evening with that thought on my face, and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Thinking." She said, "About leaving." I said, "I didn't say that." She said, "You didn't have to." She came and stood beside me, and I could feel the heat of her against the cool of the evening, and she said, "Cal Briggs, you have kept this ranch from disaster 4 times in 4 years, and you have not once asked for more than you earned, and you have treated every person on this place with more decency than most men treat their own family. If you think you're going to talk yourself into the idea that you don't belong here, I'm going to need you to stop and think about who taught you that." I didn't say anything. She said it wasn't anyone worth listening to. I said no. She said, "Then stop listening." She took my arm, and we stood there as the last of the sun went down over the flats, and the whole valley went that particular blue that you only see for a minute at that time of evening, and then it's gone. I am 68 now. We have been married for 13 years. The ranch is bigger than it was. We have 3 hands in summer and 2 in winter, and the north fence hasn't failed since the year I fixed it. Sage died 2 winters ago, old and soft and in his stall, which is the best end a horse can have. She is still the most capable person I have known in my life. She still sees things in the land, in the animals, in people, that most people walk right past. She saw it in me before I had fully admitted it was there to be seen. I pick up the rope from the fence post in the mornings sometimes, and I coil it right and hang it back. I think about that first day, the gray roan drifting toward her like he'd made up his own mind, her hand held out flat. The horse had to decide she was worth trusting before he'd go anywhere near her. I understand now that I made the same decision in the same slow way and came to the same place. And she was right there to meet me.